As a soulless virus spread, vulnerability and disparity bred. A nation that can lead the way, guided by head and gilded by heart. Alas, saw the divide ripped further apart. To rise above prejudice and give way to justice, to embrace every human with equity and dignity. It's time for true humanity. Our tomorrow calls out to us, invoking passion and purpose. And what each one of us does today can influence our way of living and rise as a nation of a billion thriving.
Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to the Global 12th Annual Dasra Philanthropy Week. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I think it's good evening here, but it's good morning somewhere, and it's good afternoon somewhere else. So the theme for this year's forum is A Billion Thriving, and the Dasra Philanthropy Week marks the beginning of this movement that each one of us must make our own. If there is one takeaway that we'd like you to walk away with through our session today, as well as dialogues across the week, it is that we urgently need to shift conversations in philanthropy to talk not only of surviving, but also of thriving. And we can enable our most vulnerable to thrive only when each of us embraces a strong lens of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We're calling this JEDI in all our work. Welcome to this session. It is called The Family and the Nation, and it thrills me to no end to have the voice, influence, and for us to be able to kick off The Family and the Nation with Dr. Y.K. Hamied. He's the chairman of CIPLA. He represents the second generation of CIPLA's founding family. A renowned scientist, Dr. Hamied obtained his PhD in organic chemistry in 1960 from the University of Cambridge, under the tutelage of Nobel laureate Lord Alexander Todd. I must admit that organic chemistry was perhaps one of my hardest subjects, so I can only imagine a PhD in that. He joined CIPLA the same year as R&D officer and is now the chairman in a non-executive role. For up to 60 years, Dr. Hamied has been an insightful R&D leader, a courageous, industrious captain of industry, and an outspoken statesman on global pharma. From affordable drugs and HIV to enabling one of the world's largest portfolio of drugs and devices in inhalation therapy, his pioneering work and immense contribution to healthcare have been celebrated around the world. For his distinguished service to the pharmaceutical industry, in 2005, Dr. Hamied was awarded the Padma Bhushan by the government of India, and many other accolades, from the 25 greatest global living legends to the Public Health Hero Award, to 20 global Indians who have challenged convention and created history, and I could go on, but it's pretty cool that in 2020, the Department of Chemistry at the University of Cambridge was named Yusuf Hamied Department of Chemistry. Dr. Hamied has been the recipient of several Lifetime Achievement Awards, and he's still standing here, so I'm sure there's many more awards for you to claim. But today we're not talking about only the amazing work that you've done in healthcare. But I wanted to start off, Dr. Hamied, so our title is sort of The Family and the Nation. And I wanted to kick off because I had heard you speak at a Harvard Business School alumni event of your journey, and where did family values anchor you, and how did all of this begin, and really what keeps you motivated?
I think my father came from a very humble home. This was in UP. My grandfather was a judge, and my father took an interest in chemistry, went and did a PhD in chemistry in Germany in 1928, came back to India, and in 1935, he started CIPLA. So I'll give you the recent history, otherwise we'd be here all day. Then in 39, he was always a nationalist in the freedom movement against the British, etc., etc. A good friend of both Mahatma Gandhi, Pandit Nehru, and Sardar Patel. And he started CIPLA in 35, 36. Gandhi came and visited CIPLA in 1939. Now, that was a very important event in the life of CIPLA, in my life, and everybody's life, because he instilled in us at that time self-reliance and self-sufficiency, and being national-minded for India. And the reason for that was that the British had offered Gandhi independence if India supported England in the war effort. This is what India did. And we supplied, and CIPLA rose to the occasion and supplied many medications to the Indo-British Army at the time during the Second World War. And that's how CIPLA came up over the years. Today, we are an 85-year-old company, and we've traced out the history of CIPLA in a book that was published a month ago, which is the CIPLA story from 1935 onwards. And I think a lot of what you're hearing me talk is related in that interesting table book. It's like a personal autobiography of myself and I think the family. So it answers most of the questions that you are likely to ask me over the course of this interview. But you can rest assured that what we have done over the years has been very much nationalistic, very much pro-India, etc. We have expanded now globally and set up factories in South Africa, in China, in USA, in Morocco, in Uganda, etc. So we have now looked at a global picture for CIPLA, as well as very much a local scenario.
Yes,
Anything
indeed.
else? Tell me.
Yes. So I actually spent the whole weekend reading this book.
Oh, you did?
Of yours. And what I liked about it, when you compare it to other autobiographies, I always try to go to where all the pictures are, because you want to kind of fast forward about the life and walk through those pictures before reading everything. And so I really enjoyed the first chapter. I was telling Romana this, a lot about, the history and the origin. And I know that, over here, just when you speak to, or it's quoted around your father, it's not Britain alone which is ruling over us, but the intellectual and industrial superiority of the West. If progress in science-based industry was to be made, individual Indians would have to shake off their apathy and take the initiative into their own hands. Tell me more, Dr. Hamied, about your story. You've done some really courageous things. There were milestones in the journey, right? Whether it was the patent law, whether it was the HIV drugs. Walk us through a bit about that journey and what keeps you anchored through that.
When I came back to India and worked in CIPLA, I felt that the backbone of the health industry, the healthcare industry, was who makes the active ingredients. I mean, it's easy to make tablets and fill capsules, but who makes the active ingredients that go into the drugs? And this is something that I helped to initiate in India in the early 60s. That look, India has to produce its own raw materials. And this, by the grace of God, over the years, not only CIPLA, but many, many Indian companies took up the challenge, and we are now quite a lot self-sufficient in raw materials that we produce. And I've always said that if India and China together stopped supplying medicines and raw materials, the world health industry would collapse. So the whole world is today very much dependent on India and China. And India today has been called the pharmacy capital of the world. But that is another story. Then of significance for CIPLA has been that we took an initiative early on in respiratory medicine. That is inhalers and nasal sprays, nebulizers. And that even today is very, very, I'm a big believer that you have to breathe to live. And if you can't breathe, and you've seen somebody who's a severe asthmatic, I mean, it's heart-rending. So that is something that we did at a very early stage in our existence. Then one day, a gentleman comes to me and says, look, would you like to look at making antiretrovirals for AIDS? That was in the year 1990. And that's when we started producing drugs for HIV and AIDS. And that, I think, in Cipla's career was the turning point, that in the year 2000, we offered, or in 2001, February, we offered an AIDS cocktail at $1 a day, totally legal, totally everything kosher, and against a price prevailing at that time of $12,000 per patient per year. And that was the turning point. And then that was one major achievement that today one can be proud as an Indian that what India is doing today is 90% of all the ARV drugs, antiretroviral drugs for Africa are produced in India. And about 18 million people are being treated for HIV and AIDS. And this pioneering work was started by Cipla way back in the year 2000. And I sincerely believe that as a philanthropist or as Dasra, that we have helped save millions of lives by this effort. And then came 2000 and early 2000 when there was a big anthrax scare. And again, Cipla rose to that occasion and supplied drugs for anthrax, ciprofloxacin at the time. Then came bird flu and swine flu. And again, there was no drugs for that. And again, Cipla rose to the occasion and we started making a drug called oseltamivir, anti-flu, and provided that not only to India, but the rest of the world as well. Then, of course, now we are with COVID, and again, with the pandemic, current pandemic, we are doing whatever best possible to supply both drugs and diagnostics. And of course, sanitizers and whatnot. Unfortunately, we are not in the manufacture of vaccines.
Yes.
But we have approached many vaccine producers as to whether they would tie up with us and we would go into vaccine manufacture in the future if that comes by. So this is the whole history of Cipla in recent years and what we've been doing.
And Dr. Hamied, tell me, and we have a question also that's being asked of is private public and is public private? And a little bit has it been difficult to balance, running a business or having the business be successful? And I know the family has moved to a strong set of professionals running, but there's underlying core values of the business, right? For access to affordable drugs. And is that a trade-off? Do you see, how have you tried to imbibe both of these values, which some say are in tension of each other, to actually exist through this time?
I think you have to balance two types of drug companies. One are the so-called big pharma that have monopoly drugs. And the second is the generic industry that copies drugs. And we unfortunately fall as yet into the second category, that we are in the generic business, not in the monopoly drug business. Both are essential, by the way. But when it comes to generic drugs, you do not have a monopoly. You are in the non-exclusive area. And when you're in a non-exclusive area, many people are competing, and because of the competition, prices have to be competitive. So if you want lower prices of affordable medicines, you cannot afford a monopoly. And I've been all for science. I've been all for inventions. I'm a scientist. Scientists should be rewarded if they invent something. But I've always in my life been against monopoly. And this is the key to the pharmaceutical industry, philanthropy, pricing, distribution of drugs, is this fight between non-exclusive and exclusive. So this is something I think Dasra should bear in mind when it comes to industry, etc. Then because we are in healthcare, it is very, very essential to realize that you're saving lives, you're caring for people. And therefore, you have to compromise business with a humanitarian approach to what you're doing. And I think we learned this lesson many, many years ago. I learned it from my father and from the nationalist movement that went on in the 20s and 30s with Mahatma Gandhi, etc. And that, unfortunately, in today's day and age, business is running in the forefront, and that human aspect of humanitarian approach is lacking. And this is where I think Dasra can play a very important role, because this is why I agreed to come on your program today, was this sentence, that Dasra acts as a catalyst. And to me, that is very, very important. We are looking for catalysts to tell us what to do and what best to do. And maybe Dasra could be another Mahatma Gandhi to us in the year 2021 and tell us what should we be doing for the next 5, 10, 20 years in philanthropy and improving the quality of life. You know, one of the things I don't know has been mentioned to you or not has been the CIPLA mission statement, that it's not the amount of money you make, but what is your contribution to society? And that's very, very important.
And Dr. Hamied, I'm sure you could probably give us a much better definition of what a catalyst is. I know the last time you spoke, you talked a lot about the notebooks that you would be writing all the formulas in. And so it was perhaps your brainchild that allowed for finding all the chemicals that come together in these generics. So I hope you do have a museum with all your notebooks. There's only one photo
Yes.
of your notebook in the book, so you must do that. But as you speak about the generics,
I've given to CIPLA's archive department, I think, 20 notebooks.
But what keeps you grounded in this and ensuring that the company continues with these sets of values? And also, you know, we went through a time of nation building, and then it went into let's open up everything. Do you think we're retracting, or there is a need to retract and be more nation building? I know you had said once before that China provides all of our penicillin and that our dependencies need to be decreased, but is that part of the nation building you see as the next wave?
It has to be. Don't forget, one of the things, people ask me all my success stories, and I relate them like I've just related to you. But nobody asks me for failures. And I think the biggest failure in my life has been family planning. And I think Dasra could play a very important role by initiating something in the area of family planning. I remember in 1960, when I came back to India, the Bombay population was 2 million. And even at that time, 50% of the population slept on the pavements of Bombay. And that horrified me. And today the population is 24 million or 22 million. And the government estimate for Bombay by the year 2050 is 40 million. Now, I think if there's one major issue that today worries me for India is population and family planning. And I think you could play a very important role in advocating what should be done in this area. Because it went, earlier on, it went very well. And then suddenly, when Sanjay Gandhi brought in his, his
extreme measures, yes.
It's collapsed and never surfaced again.
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, we are working very closely with programs that work with adolescent girls and really giving choice. I think where we have progressed as a society is to have choice. I know there were a set of questions that went out to ask men and women what was the world's greatest invention, and men said the printing press and women said the contraceptive pill, the birth control pill. So I know you were in touch with the inventor of the pill. I'm going to move, sir, to where do you spend?
The pill died recently.
Oh, how sad. But the pill lives on. Tell us a bit about, and I'd love, Romana, for you to come in as I ask this question to Dr. Hamied. How are you spending your time? How have you seen the role of philanthropy emerge for you? I know that CIPLA Foundation and Romana have focused a lot on palliative care, but how are you, where has your time been going, and what does that look like? And then Romana, I'll have you come in as well.
Well, I'm a great believer in palliative care and nursing and the alleviation of suffering. And that is where this palliative care unit, CIPLA, started in 1997. And it's been very, very active. And I sincerely believe that, again, Dasra could play a very important role in setting up throughout India similar palliative care units and home services to treat people in their twilight years. And it doesn't only have to be for cancer, it could be for many other diseases as well. And this is something I think Romana is totally involved in this activity. And she'll be able to tell you more about this than I can today. But I'm fully endorsed towards palliative care. I'm a great believer in one thing that I'd like to tell your audience, and that is that a person like me or somebody like you, we should do whatever best in the knowledge that we have. Pardon? If I'm a chemist and I'm good at healthcare, I should focus on what I'm good at. And people quite often ask me to focus on things where I'm not good at, and I therefore shy away from that. So this is something I'd advise everybody. Whatever you're good at, you go forward. So two areas in which I go forward is in health and education. And in these two areas, a lot of my personal philanthropy has been involved. Would you like to know what has been the biggest satisfaction that I've had in philanthropy? Would you like to hear that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I teamed up with the Royal Society of Chemistry in England about 7 years ago. And we put up a scheme in India, teaching teachers. And this took place in 2014. And in 5 years, you'll be glad to know that we taught 25,000 teachers throughout India at both the school level and at the university level how to teach and what to teach in chemistry. Now that to me was a hell of a contribution. And then we've extended it now for another 4 years. where we are going to teach an additional 20,000 teachers, but not chemistry anymore, but teach science, physics, mathematics, biology. So they're teaching teachers in India. All my philanthropy that I do outside India or within India is always linked to India.
Mm.
And this is something I'm very proud of as an Indian as to what I'm doing for India.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hamied. Romana, I'm sure Doc has been a tremendous influence on your life and what you do. But yeah, tell us a bit about, how you've built the foundation. I know you also in your personal capacity do a lot, and just we have both generations, right, on this Zoom call.
Yeah.
So I think to hear from both of your perspectives is really wonderful.
Thank you, Neera, and thank you for having me to talk about this. I think that for me, my uncle, Dr. Hamied, and my dad have been an inspiration, because you know how you and me as mothers of young boys, we say our children don't do what we say, right? They do what we do. And I've grown up with, both my father and my uncle living their values. And I remember as a kid being taken to this arid land in 1993 by Dr. Hamied. And I said, "What are you building here? Which factory?" And he said, "No, we're going to put up a palliative care center." And people thought he was crazy, because what is palliative care in 1993? And in 2021, it's still a foreign concept. So I stand on very, very tall shoulders, because what I'm able to do is because of what they did. And I'm honestly just trying to follow in their footsteps. CIPLA Foundation gives me the opportunity to learn about governance, compliance, to strategize our giving on a corporate level. And I take those learnings and teachings into the family foundation. Because I think family foundations really should follow the same compliances, because it is the family in both cases that are the donors, either via the corporate or via privately. But yes, the family, Dr. and Mr. Hamied, give me a lot of support to do things faster in the family foundation, to take more risks, and to be more flexible. And that's how I'm able to straddle both the corporate and the personal legacy, actually.
No, that's great to hear. Romana, tell us more. We're talking about the family and the nation, but really it's about what we see as the future of, we're calling sort of family philanthropy. And there is our generation that is engaging far earlier in how we participate in making change. How have you seen some of that evolve for yourself, and do you have any advice for others that are on this call, sort of on the fence or not really sure?
Yeah, so I think that I would follow on from what Doc said. If you're a bit unsure, do what you do best, right? So get involved in how people are giving in your field, because you'll understand it. You'll have domain expertise. It won't be as daunting for you if you give to an area that you're doing every day in your corporate world. And also you'll know how to go the last mile, because you know where your customer line stops. So I'm very clear that with CIPLA, where how far CIPLA can go, and it goes pretty far, because it's always at the next, striving for affordability and accessibility, and yet that's not always accessible and affordable to the last mile. So then, I follow the CIPLA's Good at Health kick, and we diversify into public health. So, and that, a lot of people come to talk to me, they're embarking on their journey. It's confusing, your inbox is full of requests, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, give big, give small, but just start giving. Don't think about it, don't overthink it, just give, and you'll learn as you go along. But if you want to be less daunted, then give in your area or give in your profession.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, Dr. Hamied and Rumana. I want to read something from the book just before we close, and these are your words. I know you're here, but I want to repeat them anyway because I want people to actually pick up your book and go through the pages and feel the journey yourself. But I was struck with this. There is another kind of chemistry between people that is even more important to us at CIPLA. We've always sought to work with people who have bright minds and their hearts in the right place, strong in the belief that access to affordable quality medicine is a fundamental human right. Caring for life gives purpose and meaning to our work in laboratories and factories and doctors' clinics in India, in palliative care units, and across the world. Whatever changes the future may bring, this is the one fundamental thing that will not change because it is what makes us CIPLA. And so thank you both for sharing your story on the family and the nation. And I'll hand it over. Yes, yes.
Okay. My parting thing is that whoever is in this meeting, if they have any suggestions, in fact, you as well, and Dasra as well, that you can make to us, essentially in the area of health care and education, particularly in healthcare, one thing that is coming up where we are very much involved, not mentioned so far, was antimicrobial resistance, the resistance to some of the drugs and how to cope with it. So any suggestions on even on a personal level you can make, or your audience can make, or Dasra can make to CIPLA, to myself, Rumana, individually, what we should look at and what we should do would be more than welcome. And that is one of the reasons I've taken part in today's meeting, is to learn what can we do more in the future. Because so far what we've done on our own. We need help of people like you.
Thank you, sir. Indeed, the future is collaborating. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Dinker to launch our India Philanthropy report and really speak to this opportunity.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Neera, Dr. Hamied, and Rumana for a very enlightening opening. Before we go into the report, I am Dinkar, I'm a partner at Bain, and it was my honor and privilege to co-author this year's report. Before we dive into the findings of the report, we have a poll question, please. Okay. With the poll question behind us, and I see most of our audience kind of got it in the neighborhood. So thank you. So this year's philanthropy report, as I said, I'm Dinkar, I'm a partner at Bain, and look forward to introducing this report over the next 10 minutes or so. Just to orient us, the last year has been tough. We all know the pandemic, the double shock. The double shock is both the healthcare pandemic, or the healthcare impact of the pandemic, and the economic impact of all what followed around the pandemic and fighting the pandemic. At a minimum, what this created was a massive demand surge for the services provided by the nonprofits. Actually, the nonprofits were truly the front line in fighting the pandemic, and they also were the front line in managing the fallout of the pandemic on the economic sphere as well. And that actually has put pretty substantial pressure on sources of funding. Our report will talk about how the household incomes actually declined in the last year on an average across the country, which would translate into actually smaller retail giving pie, lesser surplus for people to actually give and retail donors to give. And it's also actually been a challenge on the corporate front. So that reduces the corpus available for CSR. And not just that, there's been diversion of, I shouldn't use the term diversion, but new causes have emerged which have actually taken away some of the corpus available on the philanthropic side, specifically around the pandemic and so on and so forth, which has come at a cost of some of the older causes. And the result of all this has actually been quite substantial stress in the sector. The resilience stress test, which Dasra run with a set of NGOs, threw up that 60% of the NGOs actually saw their funding decline in the last year. It has been a very tough year. But having said this, the philanthropic space has grown. In all fairness, this is actually FY20, so it doesn't necessarily include all of the last year, but some part of it. The way to read this chart, the left side is the pie, the philanthropic pie in FY19. The right side is actually the similar chart for FY20. The way to read this would be, this is a square pie chart. So there are segments. Each segment of giving is actually each of the columns there, and sub-columns, so to speak, within that. Three things I want this group to look at. The first one's the growth. So the number on the top right of the square chart, you'd see it was $7.2 billion, 52,000 crores, give or take, in FY19. That grew to $8.9 billion or 64,000 crores in FY20. That's a 12,000 crore or a little bit more than $1.5 billion of increase, which is a very robust and a healthy 23% growth in the philanthropic space, philanthropic funding in India, private philanthropic funding. The second thing to note is, if you were to compare the columns, you will find that the foreign sources are relatively flat. You need to look at the number on top of the columns. So foreign sources are flat, more or less. The domestic corporations have grown, but not enough. The big growth has actually come from the individual philanthropists. So that's the sector, that's the part of our philanthropic space which has been driving this growth of 23% over the last year. And the third point is focus on the red in the last column. That has actually been the big chunk which has grown. So that's the family philanthropists, people giving as a family and at scale, which has actually powered the growth. If we were to do the comparison, a full 2/3 of this growth of 12,000 crores or $1 billion and a bit in India has actually come from donations by the family philanthropists giving. That has been the driving engine of the space in India in the last year or so. And it's not just money. Family philanthropy is a many splendored thing. So it's a growing source of capital, obviously. It's not just capital they bring, it's also the source of almost all of the risk capital or the innovation capital in the space. So most other funders would actually fund established programs versus actually focusing on newer models or the experimentation in the space, which is actually quite required, quite critically required. It is also the capability capital, in the sense, if you are the CSR law limits the funding which can actually be plowed back into institution building of the nonprofit to 5%. That number a bit higher on the foreign sources is 20%. This is the unencumbered source of capital which allows, which actually enables investments back into the capability of the nonprofits. It's also a very flexible source of capital. Now, this is something which I think a range of nonprofits learned over the last year, the flexibility which the family philanthropists provide to their business model, unlike some of the other donors who have the constraints in which they give. There is the benefit of advocacy, which some of these high-profile individuals bring to the table. And then the last is the governance and the quality of running of some of these institutions. So it's quite, as in depending on the scale of giving, it's not always grant making, it's quite owning and operating, which actually upgrades the whole quality and nature of governance in this particular space. It is a many splendored thing. It has got many advantages, not just the money which you see which is flowing through. But having said this, there remains considerable headroom to growth in here. So the chart on the left actually compares what similar brackets of wealth in the India, and it's in rupees 1,000 crores, the brackets of wealth, because we've had to adjust to reflect as in purchasing power more than anything else. And how do they compare with their American counterparts? And you actually see the red is in India is in red, the US is in gray. The gap of what is given by families in India versus what's given elsewhere in the world is actually quite substantial. So, and there is quite substantial pools of capital. The data rows at the bottom talk about the pools of capital, including the number in US dollars right at the bottom, which is available out there. There's substantial amounts of net worth available. The giving is not as extensive or as deep as it would be in some of the other parts of the world. And I think the question which we ask is, why is this giving so constrained? And the three broad drivers, three broad sets of barriers, not exhaustive, but there's a set of barriers around the space, both in terms of scale of the NGOs and also the scalability of the place, the ability of the space to actually absorb large pools of capital. Also, some of these donors have a long horizon to actually their giving, and not all of our nonprofits actually have similarly long horizons on their for themselves. There's also space. There's also challenges around the intermediaries. And there are two broad areas. The information available in the space is so fragmented. It creates islands of information versus actually an integrated information market, allowing people to navigate the space better. And there's the matchmaking issue of putting together the funders with the recipients or the beneficiaries. And that matchmaking needs to actually be addressed as well as we think about scaling the space up. More money would come in if you have a more vibrant space with the right vehicles for the money to flow through. And there's actually the whole topic around family support as an assistance to the funders, the donors, in actually navigating the space, and a broader supportive ecosystem to enable them to actually do some of these things. It's a bit of the best analog I actually heard through our preparation work for this report, but it's a little bit like the venture capital space and the startup space are mutually reinforcing and coexisting. The family philanthropist and the nonprofit space is similarly mutually coexisting. You can't have one without the other. One can't grow without the other growing hand in hand. And just to close the report out, we do think the potential of family philanthropy is transformational. So the chart on the left talks about the wealth pyramid in India, and don't propose to walk through this, but the wealth pyramid is quite substantial. And if they were to give even to an extent, as in not fully like in elsewhere in the world, but only to a smaller extent, just family philanthropy can potentially double the total private philanthropic funding available in India. So even if they were to give half as much as is done elsewhere, the space would double. If they were to do more, the space has substantial headroom to grow. At scale, we believe family philanthropy can double the size of India's philanthropic space. With that opening, back to you, Megha.
Thank you, Dinkar, and thank you for that, for those really exciting statistics. Before I sort of continue on where you left, I really wanted to extend a big thank you to Bain and Company and the Bain team when we sort of worked on this project for the last 3 months. It's been an exciting journey, and we are hoping that this is one of the many philanthropy products that will come in the space. This is our first fund to articulate what family philanthropy in terms of where it stands today and where really that vision is. Your last graph talks about $15 billion is the potential for the family market to grow to, which is about 106,000 crore in Indian rupees. And that's a super exciting number for us to sort of even look at and move and think about the how to achieve and get there. The concluding segment of this report really highlights the 5 tailwinds that we have seen in 2021. And we are hoping that just talking a little bit to those tailwinds helps draw attention to what can really surge family philanthropy ahead. In many of the forums, we've sort of spoken about these, so they're not going to be new to many of you. But the intent is in the next segment of our conversation, we have our discussants, and they would throw more light on each of these tailwinds and actually bring to life from the experiences that they come from. And so the first tailwind talks about the collaboration paradox. And I know collaboration is a word that's been thrown around everywhere. We keep talking about collaboration. We see it as a panacea for all challenges that exist in the sector. Having said that, collaborating within a family setup brings its own challenges, brings in within itself a lot of family dynamics. But we also see that a lot of stubborn challenges that need to be solved, they need a systemic way to approach to solve them. And so we sort of unpack a little bit, hearing from Peter Smith today on what his collaboration paradox has been when he's been thinking about his philanthropy. The next piece, giving capacity, and Dinkar spoke to that. If you look at the statistics, only a handful of nonprofits have an annual budget of about 5 crores, which is close to $50 million. And the cumulative budget of NGOs in India is close to 800 billion. And so while all of this exciting money pumps in, how do we actually invest and lean into NGOs so that they scale up and are able to not just solve these problems at impact, but also sort of faster? Proximate power, we end up hearing and listening to people saying giving money in their immediate geography, in their immediate sort of what they understand, where they belong to. There's nothing wrong in that. But if you look at the statistics, 77% of the wealth sits in Bombay, Delhi, and Bangalore. And then the donations are about 85%. So what we are trying to say is that the need really is sitting in rural India, in the underserved, and how do we get this money really back to where the need is most. Here we've also unpacked a little bit of conversation around the diaspora. And so increasingly people are sort of talking, wanting, interested in learning and engaging about India so that there is a giving to India, and how can we sort of address that? If you look at it, India is now home to 37 unicorns. And what that means is entrepreneurship is at its peak. But then to be able to, again, channel this money in the most appropriate manner, how do we prepare an ecosystem that sort of addresses the needs of these 37 unicorns is crucial. And we have a few ecosystem players in our conversations who will sort of allude to that. Lastly, Neera touched upon that when we sort of spoke, when we heard Dr. Hamied and Romana speak, but what is happening with the now generation? We are refraining from calling them next generation because these are folks who are very much in the business, active. And so how do we engage them? We've seen in the last year, come pandemic, come the bill, amendment to the FCRA bill, we've seen that now generation has actually leaned into some of the not so popular topics as well, but then brought them into center stage to speak through. And so with that, I would sort of want to talk quickly before I sort of move to Hari. And Hari, I see you right there and kind of help you, help hear from you a little bit of the larger macro trend. I do want to flash the poll again. We heard people saying that about 0.1% of giving actually happens from family as on today. But if there's one thing that I want everybody to leave from this conversation, could we have the poll, please? I would love for all of us to walk away with that number. Could we share the results, please? And so that's absolutely right. We've got a potential of about $14 billion that can be unlocked if we are sort of able to look at these tailwinds and the other perspectives that my key discussants will bring in. With that, sort of over to you, Hari. Hari, you have played a pivot role in, advising Rohini Nilekani, as well as 15 years of your leadership role at the Gates Foundation, speaking to not just Indian families, but also Giving Pledge members. Would love to draw on your insights and what would be your advice?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Megha. And let me start by, congratulating Dasra and Bain again for, yet another annual philanthropy report. I mean, I think the value I see of this report is, even operating in a pretty fragmented data ecosystem, as Dinkar mentioned, that you're able to come up with, pretty coherent, cogent analysis and insights, which have now become a standard for to inform the philanthropy sector both in India and globally. So it is really a public service that you guys do, and I'm really glad to see what you came out with in this year's report. I'm also especially glad that you chose to focus on family philanthropy this year. Let me start with my personal reflection on this. Nothing as powerful as Dr. Hamied's, but this is just about actually 10 years for me in terms of engaging with the Indian philanthropy ecosystem, so to speak. I've been working with the Gates Foundation for many years before, but March of 2011 is when we had this convening of many of India's ultra high net worth individuals, where we also had Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Melinda Gates, the three of them joining. It's the only joint visit the three of them have ever made to India, and that was in March of 2011. So it's a nice time, 10 years hence, to just look back and see what all has shifted. And in India, I think it's you can always find enough reasons to be cynical, enough reasons to focus on the things that don't work. But I think there is a value in taking this longitudinal approach. I personally speaking, and an optimist on India. I mean, I feel you bet against India at your own peril. And while we do take a lot of time, getting things right, we almost always, inexorably do get things right. And to me, the growth of the domestic philanthropy sector is one such. I mean, if you go back to where things were in 2011, very few active voices for philanthropy, very few ecosystem players. I'm glad Dasra has lasted that decade, and hopefully several more ahead of you. But now there are several other Dasra-like players who also come in, while it's easy to get the sense of we should have done more, could have done more. To me, COVID and the way the domestic philanthropy sector responded is actually a test case of what was probably in development in the decade before, and what came to fruition during the last 8-9 months. Because I think the fact that India was able to mount a pretty successful response by many yardsticks had a lot to do with the very significant increase in philanthropic giving by families and individuals. If I look at the top line from the India Philanthropy Report, the fact that even as foreign and CSR funding declined, we saw a net increase because of these two pools, the families and individuals, is really good news, because I think that is the most resilient pool. It is the pool that, like you said, is likely to be the most flexible, the most understanding of country needs and contexts. And I think the conditions for the growth of those pools is ripe. If you were to ask me, I would look to the next decade, and I think in India one needs to have a decadal view, because you'll always feel bad and sad in a year or two, but you'll feel good at the end of 10 years. I think this is going to be the golden age of family philanthropy in India, the next decade. And I think it's incumbent on all of us who are on this call to do our best to try and maximize the potential of the 5 tailwinds that you spoke of. I think, to me, the fact that collaborative giving accelerated so dramatically during COVID is a really positive sign. In fact, I think there are few countries that accomplished what India was able to. And I think we need to capitalize on the momentum of that. Another positive that I'm very optimistic about is, what we used to call the next gen, but I like your now gen, formulation, because I think that impatience to, lean in, get things done now, and also to engage with sectors and issues that may not have historically been popular. Both of those bode extremely well for the future of family philanthropy in India. So in terms of my own insights or my own reflections on where things stand, personal reflections. Okay, these are not institutional reflections, because I think for me, the couple of years working with Rohini were extremely instructional. That was actually my ground zero to learn about the state of philanthropy in India, because when you're in the Gates Foundation, you have an outsider's view. It was a very different perspective being with Rohini, and I was lucky to have the opportunity to work with someone as visionary as her. But I think of the fairly challenging discussions we used to have at Dasra. Was a part of that when with Omidyar Network, we were trying to get that accountability and governance collaborative going. It was really hard going. No one really wanted to participate, and we had lots of promising conversations that translated into a grand zero. But you fast forward, to 2020, and what happened with the ICRF, the RCRC, several other collaborative platforms. So I think this the tendency or the urge to collaborate is increasing. We need to find ways to feed it. But I think it's very important in that time to meet families where they are, because it's been my lesson that pushing people towards causes or issues that they are not comfortable with, Dr. Hamied spoke of that, does not really pay off. So I think it's very important. India has needs in many areas, and I think it's important to respect where the families want to go and find opportunities to to help promote giving in those areas. And I think eventually things can expand. I think a couple of other thoughts that I feel are important. I think the next gen, now gen engagement is key. But I would be very happy to see more of a blend between, operating foundations and grant making as families start to expand their philanthropy. I think it's great if people want to get into, the operating mode. You do have a direct connect with change on the ground, and sometimes that can feel very fulfilling. But just given India's scale, diversity, heterogeneity, it's not possible for, even the 100 biggest operating foundations to solve India's problems. You need a lot more. And I think that's where having a vibrant, NGO, civil society, social entrepreneur ecosystem, which can only thrive if there is a fair amount of flexible funding from philanthropists to also feed it. So I'd say balancing and having a continuum where you also do grant making alongside, operating foundations, that would be key. Another important area, there has been progress, but I think much more needs to be done, is just bridging the gap with government. Many families who appear very comfortable engaging government on their business issues tend to not do the same for their philanthropic issues. And I think we are in an in an environment where I think it really is going to take Indian voices, Indian champions to shape the ecosystem. And I think developing more of that comfort in engaging with government, and the government is seeking more partnership, be it on large platforms like the aspirational districts, or as we saw with Swachh Bharat, many of the flagship missions of the government now are more open for domestic engagement and philanthropy. And I'd say the last one, again, going back to Dr. Hamied's example on building the capacity and capabilities of 25,000 teachers. I think we need to do a lot more of that in India. And I think coming from the Gates Foundation's background, and I am going to take up Dr. Hamied and Rumana on the follow-up on both family planning and AMR. We do a lot of work and we have lots of ideas that we'd love to share. But I think investing in strengthening the capacity and capability of India's innovation ecosystem. We tend to look a lot on the health and agriculture, financial inclusion, those sides. But I think strengthening that ecosystem for innovation by putting in more risk capital, I think is an area that family philanthropy could do a lot more. It's very tough for institutional philanthropy to put in that pure form of risk capital, but innovation needs risk capital to thrive. And so I think strengthening India's institutions, research institutions, building the capability of our upcoming researchers is going to be super critical for the next generation and the next decade. Like I said, I am super optimistic about where we're going to go over the next 10 years, because I've seen how far we've come in the last 10 years. And, as on behalf of the foundation, happy to have partnerships with organizations like Dasra and others. We look forward to contributing as best as we can. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Megha.
Thank you so much, Hari, and such interesting points and valuable points. I'm going to pick on your point on the now generation, redefining philanthropy, and actually invite my next speaker, Sonal. I see you already there. So Sonal, you're backed by a legacy of philanthropy. How was your perspective shaped by that? And what have you learned as the CEO of the GMSP Foundation? We've heard some of the macro trends, and Dinkar spoke a lot to what the ecosystem, what the market looks like, what's playing, what's not playing, barriers, etc. But would love to actually take a pause, step back, and hear your own personal perspective here, please. Sonal, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Yeah, you're unmuted.
Thank you. I've done that so many times in the last year, and I keep on doing it. Well, you asked me about two P's, philanthropy and perspective. And I actually wanted to talk about a third P, which I think links them both together. And that P is privilege. And I see my role as CEO of my parents' foundation as one of immense privilege. And I'm very aware that I didn't earn that legacy of philanthropy. It was good to hear Dr. Hamied talk about previous generations. And I too think about previous generations, especially my parents. So my father, he came from a poor family in Mombasa. He was one of 13 children. He had 7 sisters, 5 brothers. And he was the first to come to the UK. He was age 19 with no more than a few pennies in his pocket. And similarly, my mother was always passionate about children. She became a young headmistress in a nursery school in Uganda. And then she married my father, having met him only 2 times, and moved to the UK with him. And when I was little, I would love, and still actually, I would love to hear stories of what their upbringing was like. Because it sounded so free and so adventurous. And the one theme that would always come out, and that they would say, is that whilst they were not rich in possessions, they were rich in the values of trust, humility, and respect. And those have been a really defining theme of our family and the foundation. But coming back to privilege, which I was talking about earlier, that's something that I've benefited from and my parents did not. Like so many young philanthropists who've been born into wealth, I enjoyed a private school education, holidays abroad, and frankly, a leg up or a door opened for me whenever I needed one. And this privilege is something that I reflected on a lot. And it's about much more than just money to spend or a comfortable lifestyle, because it's that privilege that creates a bubble in which the wealthy can exist. And it shields us from the realities of this world and from what I think the true meaning of philanthropy should signify. Many people in this virtual room will be aware of the criticism that philanthropy's faced in recent years. And that's something I think that's really different from my parents' generation to my generation. But I believe that on the whole, philanthropists come from a good place and they have good intentions. I'm optimistic, like Hari is about India. But I think that we should be honest with ourselves. We should reflect and introspect and maybe admit that we as philanthropists can sometimes exist in an echo chamber. And what I mean by that is where the voices that we hear and the people that we encounter, they look and they sound the same as us. And perhaps we might find that we might meet over expensive lunches, take decisions in closed door meetings, put shiny plaques with our names on buildings and give out one-off checks. And the problem with this is that it puts the philanthropist at the center, which really is the reverse of what it should be. It should be about communities and the grassroots organizations that serve them. And we as philanthropists, of course, we have a role, but that role is one of facilitation, of support, I think that we need to listen deeply, and we need to learn from those who know best, who are the activists and leaders at the front line. And this is particularly true for the diaspora, who aren't even based in India. So I think that this allows us to use that position of privilege that we have in service of their work. So it's this acute awareness of my privilege that has really shaped my perspective on approaching philanthropy. Because I think that unless people like me use our privilege to change the way we do things, and that's not just about giving more funding, it's about the way in which we fund and the way in which we approach the problem, then we might be able to help a few more people. We might get more girls in school or better health outcomes, but I don't think that we'll achieve the kind of systemic change that we all talk about. So in taking this approach, we've learned a few things at GMSP Foundation, and it was good to see some of those things being highlighted in the report. So hopefully that means we're on the same page. But I wanted to talk about three things. And the first thing was about the fact that we've learned that grassroots leaders need flexibility, particularly to adapt when disaster strikes. And after the year that we've all had, I think we all know all too well about disaster striking. And like many of you, we saw firsthand the amazing rapid reaction of so many NGOs that literally had to pivot their services overnight to provide this emergency response. But what our partners tell us, both in India and the UK actually, is that more often than not, they're already working in crisis mode. They're constantly having to adapt and adjust to challenges and crises. And COVID-19 was unique in so many ways. But what I found really interesting was that it was a disaster that affected all of us globally exactly the same time. But often the everyday crises that NGOs and communities face, they hardly even cause a flutter in the world that we funders operate in. And that's why we provide unrestricted funding to all of our partners. The second thing I wanted to talk about was financial resilience. And we've learned that NGOs need a financial buffer to allow them to bridge these really difficult periods when funding either slows down or is delayed. And unfortunately, this is quite often the case, much more than I think I'd realized when I entered the sector. And again, I think the recent crisis has exposed just how many organizations live hand to mouth when it comes to their funding, and they don't have sufficient reserves to draw on when times get tough. You know, I think there are a lot of business families in the family philanthropy sector, and I think we would never allow the companies that we invest in to operate this close to bankruptcy. So why do we allow it for our NGO partners? Before me, Hari talked about how sometimes families will advocate with the government for their businesses, but they won't in their philanthropy. So why are we wearing these two hats? And I think, again, we have to self-reflect and try and unify the way that we approach these problems. And I think when you actually think about what some of these really critical services these organizations provide, like counselling to children who've suffered sexual abuse, or legal aid to survivors of domestic violence, or medical interventions in rural areas, it really hits home as to what it actually means for these services to just suddenly stop because funding slowed down or somebody hasn't paid on time. And I think, you know, it's just yet another letdown to people who've already been let down so much. So rather than one-off checks, organizations need reliable, long-term funding so that they can plan ahead with confidence. And we funded some of our partners for over 5 years and will continue to do so. And lastly, and looping back to my parents' legacy of philanthropy and the personal perspective that you asked for, Megha, central to that legacy are the values that anchor our family. And we've learned that those same values go a long way in working with our partners. We know all too well that we don't have all the answers, and it's comforting to hear that Gates Foundation say that they also don't have all the answers, because I can't tell you how often I lie awake at night thinking, are we using our funding in the right way? Are we making enough of a difference? All this privilege, but, you know, are we actually doing something with all that we've been given? And that's why we put our trust in the expertise and the knowledge of our frontline partners, and we seek to work alongside others. And I think it would be amiss of me to not mention the critical role that Dasra have played in this learning process. As a diaspora family, Dasra has been invaluable in this regard, not only in bringing us in community with other like-minded funders and connecting us to incredible grassroots leaders, but also in understanding and sharing our core values. Now, these are the values that they're the thread, and they tie our generations together, and they tie us together with our partners, and they're the values of trust, humility, and respect. And
thank you, Sonal, so much for sharing that, and the essence of values and really trusting your grantees and listening to them and really meeting them where they are. As we keep saying, that meet the families where they are, and in a similar manner, meeting communities where they are and actually feeding to where their need is. Thank you so much for that personal perspective, Sonal. With that, I'm going to move to Peter. And Peter, I see you there, right there. Thank you, Peter. And so you bring with yourself a rich cumulative wisdom, you know, of being the chairman of Atlantic Philanthropy, co-founder of Kiawa Trust. You're a family foundation yourself, and the report talks a lot to the collaboration paradox. And I was personally really interested in hearing, when you sit around the table with other corporates, governments, and other institutional foundations, what are some of the challenges and learnings that you've seen wearing the hat of a family foundation?
Thank you very much, Megha. I think it's been an amazing session so far. I think Dasra have done a great job. When you think about the question that was posed about the learnings that we've had, in some ways it was what we had to unlearn, because you described the roles that I've played at Atlantic Philanthropies, where I was for 20 years, or with PSI or MSI, which are big INGOs. What they don't tend to have is flexibility. What they don't seem to have is an ability to respond. So when I took over the chairman role at Atlantic, which was 10 years ago, we did a survey of all of the grantees to ask them what they actually thought about dealing with Atlantic. And basically it was bureaucratic, it was procedural, it was inflexible. So when Lynn and I were talking first about India, and I'll come back to why India, we wanted to be all of the opposites. And these are not criticisms of people like USAID or of Atlantic or of anyone. I think they are large organizations. Power resides in different places. So we were very, very concerned because we were actually a family foundation. It was very small. It was about Lynn and I. And therefore, what we wanted to do was, if you like, magnify the strengths that we had. We wanted to be an economic magnifier. We wanted to be more impactful. So we wanted people to be able to come and talk to us when they wanted to. We weren't going to get them to fill in specific forms, but you know us very well. So we've always got lots of questions, but it wasn't going to be procedural. So we were looking very, very carefully when we first went to India at the type of partner that we needed. And we needed someone that would magnify our lack of presence. So the Kiawa Trust, nobody would know who we were. So we weren't credible. So how did we build our credibility? We certainly had very little experience of India, so we couldn't even demonstrate that we were competent. We had a small amount of money, so we were even cash constrained. So what could we do? So we looked at issues like commitment, building knowledge, and really being a value-added partner. And I understand the tightrope you walk when you're trying to add value to people that already have clear ideas. And part of the question was, if like the differences in India, I think the differences in the way that Bank of America, for instance, or Packard or Gates and I've worked with them all in different ways, then the style that they have in India, I know they do their best to adapt to the local culture, but they still have reporting structures, they still have approval processes. So all the time we were focusing on how we could differentiate ourselves. So at the very, very beginning, thinking about that multiplier, we worked with Dasra to say, we're interested in adolescent girls, but how do we actually go about this? How do we just create a competence? So you know that we were prepared to invest with Dasra, who had completely bought into the notion and led us on the notion, that we would create a team that would focus on girls. So for an early stage in Dasra's development, it would be cause focused, as opposed to, if like, the philanthropy, effective philanthropy focused. Doing the field report, helping, and Dasra did all the work, helping fund an exploration of all of the players in that environment. You remember we went into the giving circles, which was the first form really of collaboration. Pre that, our relationship had just been with Dasra. We'd worked very, very closely with Dasra. Then we moved into collaboration. From collaboration, we moved to the Girl Alliance. From the Girl Alliance, we helped Dasra explore what the next stage could be. We helped Dasra explore, using Bridgespan and using other outside advice, the various paths that we could follow. So all the time we've been focused on the economic multiplier. So for every dollars that we're putting in, we're going to get multiples back. We tried to build on the notion of flexibility, which would compensate for some of the larger institutions that we needed. So to get, when Dasra were able to attract US aid, that was a perfect build for Dasra and for the Kiowa Trust, because US aid brought credibility. Piramal brought additional credibility. So all of a sudden, the substance of the girls' programs in India that Dasra were implementing went on to a totally different scale. So we've tried to magnify the differences. We've tried to focus on being flexible, to be responsive, to be quick. We've never really imposed conditions on the grants. We've tended to ask Dasra what they were short of, which is a point that Sonal just made, to be as flexible as you can. What were they short of? What did they need that other people might not fund? So all of the time, differentiate yourself, become an economic multiplier, and follow those themes. When I think of the lessons that I might take from Atlantic, Atlantic couldn't match those sorts of initiatives. It was impossible. You know, we had 150 people, we were in 15 different countries, and there was a need for control and discipline that's very, very different when it's just Lynn and I talking to each other. This morning, Deval talked about, if you like, who he was. And when, with you and with Shailja, asking in this conversation, who am I actually? I know it sounds such a stupid question, but am I Atlantic? Am I PSI? Am I MSI? What am I? The perspective, and Sonal gave it of her father. I grew up in South Wales, an area of high unemployment. Most of my upbringing was, my father was unemployed. It was a coal and steel community. I went to a technical school. I really thought I was going to be a teacher and a soccer player, which was how I actually got paid to get my way through university. So I think I have an association with disadvantage. And one of the great things that came out of the Atlantic philosophy was this vulnerable and disadvantaged. When we did the work and looked at girls, which was very much Lynn, India initially was very much Lynn, and it was very, very much coming to the conclusion that adolescent girls at that time were probably the most vulnerable and disadvantaged group that we'd seen in any of the work that we'd done. If I go back to the question of collaboration, so I've worked on programs which was to abolish capital punishment in the United States. If you work in New York, then the way that you would go about that would be to talk about justice, to talk about how unjust it is to people of color. If you go to Texas, you're talking about cost. So the local adaptation of how you create a difference, how you create an improvement, really does need to be geographically constructed to blend into the values. Dasra has been a wonderful coach all of the way through. They've been a fantastic partner in watching the development and the impact on girls. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And I'm really walking away with two keywords, that economic multiplier, and just keeping that at the back of your mind as you think about collaboration. And so thank you for your insights. And I know it's a long session and you all have been great audience, but really the intent here is this is a lab and we want maximum perspectives, global perspectives in. So I hope you're sort of out there, though I can't see all of you. But my next segment, just to kind of change a little bit, I have three of my key discussants actually spotlighted together. And I'm going to start with, I don't see Joe actually here. Joe, are you there? And if you could please switch on your camera. There you go, Joe. And so we've got Joe, we've got Hiten, and we've got Priya here. I'm going to start a little bit with Joe, and please feel free in the next sort of 10 to 15 minutes to kind of also sort of speak to each other and build if you like. But Joe, you conduct a lot of conversations in education, donor education programs globally, but increasingly in South Asia. And I thought that I could actually tap a little bit of that. And what are you hearing from families there? Please wear the hat of an ecosystem builder here as an intermediary. And what do you think? What are things that are working and what are things that are not working?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mecca. It's great to be in this lab. So yes, I've been facilitating philanthropy education and strategic advice to families globally over the last 10 or so years. And in the last 18 months, I'm really pleased to say that I've had more requests from families in Asia than ever before. And I do see trends in the things that they're asking for. I hear Asian philanthropists say that they want to take more responsibility for their own social developments, challenges, and the inequalities that they see in Asia. And they want to stop being dependent on Western funding, Western bilateral donors, and Western private capital, but develop their own, expertise. I hear families seeking ways to move away from check writing towards more sustainable strategic interventions where they bring their money. Yes, obviously that's important, but they also bring their time, their dedication, their expertise, and their professionalism as well. And I think to Dr. Hamied's point, he talked about bringing his expertise, his professional expertise, and Peter talked very much about, how do you add value as a philanthropist, and really, seeking to think, what does a systemic change look like in the niche area that I want to focus my family philanthropy on. I hear families, this reinforces what Sonal was saying, families are seeking to define and align their family and their philanthropic goals. But they're also increasingly, I think, looking to align family and philanthropy goals and values towards their business and their investment goals. You hear so much talk about, impact investing, and that's so important because there is absolutely no point creating harm with one hand, possibly through your business, and then trying to mend it with the other, your philanthropy. And I increasingly also hear rising alarm about the climate crisis, and because of the negative impact that families feel this will have in Asia across everything, from women's rights to the livelihoods of the most vulnerable, to migration and civil unrest. And those concerns, incidentally, are not unique to Asian families. I hear them expressed by philanthropic families globally. So what can an intermediary organisation do? Well, social change is complex. It can feel intimidating. It doesn't have to be, but it can be intimidating. And family dynamics can also be complex and potentially intimidating as well. And so I think I've seen families really benefit from having an external expert who's come in and helped them in a number of different ways. So you can have help supporting you identify and articulate your family and your philanthropic goals, interest areas and values, and see how they can align to your business in a way that CIPLA clearly have. And also really focus and develop expertise that brings and leverages all of your assets into your philanthropy. I've heard families ask for help as they try and move and journey away from structural investments in health and education, particularly in Asia, which are, you could argue, sort of easier to visualize. They need help understanding how do you move towards addressing the root cause of a problem. And I have to say, this is one of the most important steps that you can take as a family to have more impact, is really understand the root causes. And again, to Sonal's point, to sort of talk to the beneficiary communities you're going to be working with to understand how they interpret the problem, rather than coming in with your privileged and sometimes inaccurate solution. And there are many different ways that you can achieve change beyond the check, and these often appeal to different families and even different family members. So it's not just, I have to say, families starting out that seek help and advice and donor education. It's also families who sometimes will look back over their philanthropy over the last 10 plus years and think, have I had as much impact as I could have had? Could I have done more? And if I have a individual successful intervention, that's definitely something to celebrate, but sometimes then concern about the dependency of that and what help can you get to engage others, both governments and other donors, in order to replicate that successful intervention and scale it.
Yes.
So
yes.
Just what?
So Joe, I'm going to sorry, Joe, I'm interrupting, but I really like your point, and I want to actually bring in Hipin to just kind of ask you, Hipin, that what are you, as leadership of British Asia Trust, what are some of the behaviors that you've seen of the diaspora there, right? Have certain behaviors, giving behaviors changed last year? Just your thoughts there and your learnings and observations.
Sure, thank you, Megha, for that. And look, thank you for this session as well overall to Dasra. I think what we've seen over the past year, perhaps, is usually we get families coming to us with a specific theme, a specific geographic location that they were interested in, some coming to look to understand what they could be doing better across India with their philanthropic funding. But in the past year, the pandemic, here in the UK, the diaspora have seen the images of people migrating across India. We've seen those images of people walking on the roads. And many families here started to look at it as more of a natural disaster moment, that what could you be doing differently? How could you be doing it quickly? How could you be doing it effectively? As well as balancing on the other side, the need for them to do something locally here in the UK as well. Because equally, businesses were closing around them, local families and people around them were queuing up at food banks and really finding themselves in an economic situation that they would never have imagined. And so we found that we had families who were sort of trying to balance this. I'd like to do something in the UK, probably through their company, trying to do something, being responsible locally here, but also then thinking about what to do in India as well at the same time. And rather than just giving parochially, so just giving to their home state and, in comfort areas like, I come from Gujarat, so I'm going to give my money to Gujarat. I know people there. I know how to do all of this. We found people saying, actually, there's a real issue on the ground. Where is my need? Where is the need? Where can I make a difference myself? And the challenges they were then facing were, there's no data, we don't understand where to go and make that difference. Have the NGOs I regularly support, have they pivoted quickly enough? And so many of them had done that anyway. But, how do I trust someone? How do I know where to give my money on a very immediate basis? And I think that's where intermediaries have definitely been helpful, responsible, and also their peer groups as well. Talking to friends that they knew that, what are you doing? How are you going to put some funding on the ground? So I think there's been in the past year, I think there's been a change in the way people have been thinking. How do I join hands with others? How do I make sure that I'm addressing a need quickly rather than worrying about, it's what I normally do.
Yeah. No, thanks, Satin. So that's super useful. And I'm shifting gears a little bit and calling in Priya here. Priya, you're co-founder of Antarang, and you have decades of experience in the nonprofit sector. And the report really talks about the whole capacity building, absorption capacity of nonprofits is a big challenge. And I'd love to get your thoughts as a nonprofit leader. What would you have to say to that?
Thanks, Megha. And it's been a super insightful session. And when Dinkar really spoke about the absorption capacity in the report, a couple of things that sort of came to my mind. This pandemic, more than anything else, has sort of underlined that there is no longer a sort of proportionate or linear equation between the size of the budget of an NGO and the ability to scale a solution, right? With technology coming in, Peter also alluded to collaborations in the space. I think just the ability of making sure that efficiencies of costs come into the whole picture actually has ensured that there isn't this linear sort of traditional thinking of scale being a large budget, and to achieve large outcomes you need large budgets, actually has got a little bit upended. Deval also referred to it in his mornings, this where he spoke about the NGOs almost carrying this burden of cost efficiencies in some way. So that's one thing that I wanted to sort of bring here. Sonal really very nicely put the ability of family foundations to drive their own mandates and the ability to actually bring in a lot of flexibility into their funding, right? So which means that you can build the capacity of organizations to be able to scale. And that's where, the role of intermediaries like Dasra actually comes in, where, once you identify potential solutions that can be scaled out and that can become part of, solutions to wicked problems, then you do have, you can point family foundations to make sure that they are almost giving some sort of pre-scale grant, like almost like a risk grant to be able to build the capacity of organizations like ours in this space to get ready for that massive scale almost, right? So I do believe there are a couple of these things that are already being played out. In fact, we have several family foundations where they've really acted as venture donors in this space, working very closely with us. And in fact, they've been the ones to almost tell us to test things out, get ready, build our capacity before we even go after the large scale solutions.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Priya. And you bring a good point here around how the ecosystem needs to also be ready to be able to sort of manage this demand and supply of money, as well as impact here. And on that note, I really want to invite Nikhil Tedesco. He is the CEO of National Center for Family Philanthropy. And Nick, there you are. Nick, I'd really love to sort of hear from you that what does it take to run an institution that helps other families decide where to give, how to give, hopefully why to give as well to start with. What have been some pros and challenges there? And so over to you, Nick, to hear from you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Megha. And first of all, I want to congratulate Neera and Deval for building a community of inspired philanthropists and seeding the message of giving and collaboration to an entire nation and its advocates. So well done. I am in awe of Dasra and all that you have built. I'm so grateful to be in conversation with you all today on the topic of family philanthropy, and I'd welcome your questions, your comments, your thoughts, and feedback. My hope is to share a bit of my perspective and personal experience on why it's important to institutionalize the field and the practice of family philanthropy. So it certainly goes without saying, but this is a historic moment in time for philanthropy and the world at large for so many reasons. Wealth is growing and transferring at unprecedented rates. The statistics are quite staggering. The number of billionaires has doubled in the last 10 years alone to 2,200, and their wealth grew 27% during the pandemic alone. At the same time, philanthropic intent is rising. The conversation on wealth and philanthropy continues to gain momentum as the media continues to advance the conversation with at times a critical tone, all the while donors are more readily sharing their stories and the world continues to observe the enormity of the need. Yet, philanthropic families are not fulfilling their potential. They need support. And unfortunately, capital that's available for impact is not finding its way into the hands of nonprofit leaders who are positioned to advance meaningful social and environmental change. So, what is the role of families? Well, philanthropic families are an important lever for change, as we've heard today, but often struggle to find their footing, which is why it's so important to build and fund the infrastructure to support their efforts. So perhaps I can digress for a moment to share what led me to the National Center for Family Philanthropy. I began my career in the social sector at a nonprofit focused on education and advocacy for children. But in 2010, I was invited to join the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to help build and launch the Giving Pledge campaign. And it was during my time at the Pledge that I became aware of the tremendous gap between intent and action. At the Pledge, we hosted a number of small dinners, meetings, and events that held space for donors to share their stories, their inspirations, and their struggles. And one of the most significant things that I heard at all of these meetings is the universal challenge to deploy capital, particularly at scale. We heard that individuals and families are really eager to, in fact, translate their intent to action, but are often limited by a number of factors. The factor of time, of resources, of expertise, and of confidence. And at the same time, the sector that has been built to support them is quite fragmented, it's quite opaque, and it's really difficult to navigate. These families really need a trusted partner, they need a curator, they need a guide. And this really is kind of the impetus. This is why we must continue to institutionalize family philanthropy. It's really to unlock the potential of philanthropic families to be purposeful stewards of the public trust. So it leads to the question, and really has led me to reflect on, what are the benefits of institutionalizing family philanthropy and how do we go about doing that? So we at the National Center for Family Philanthropy have been reflecting on that for a number of years, but very intentionally over the last year, as we have been at this moment of shift following our longtime founder, Ginny Esposito, and really going through a full comprehensive strategic planning process. And we really believe that institutionalizing the practice serves three purposes. Really, the first is to elevate the conversation on effective philanthropy and really to elevate that at the local, the national, and the global level. And that really includes the practices of impactful and intentional giving. So really, in many ways, the first step to unlocking more capital, which really is the end goal here, is to demystify the practice of effective family philanthropy, right? There's a lot of questions around what it means to do this work and to do this work well, particularly for those who are newer to the practice of philanthropy. So the first point here is, how do we demystify this? And I often remark that family philanthropy has many points of inflection, these moments to either embrace proven solutions and advance that momentum, or quite honestly, to stall out due to an uncertainty and a lack of clarity. And so many families, particularly those, again, who are newer to the journey, find themselves without the necessary support at these critical inflection points. And really, this is what communities of practice like Dasra can do, right? They can demystify and continue to advance people along this journey. And really, therefore, that leads us to the second point, the second purpose, really, which is to activate. It's to activate and connect a diverse and engaged peer community of philanthropic families and partners to be able to drive that support that is needed. We often say that community is perhaps one of the most important elements for a successful family philanthropy effort. Philanthropic families must be in active dialogue with one another. They have to learn together, they have to grow together, they have to have a safe place to test, to try, and to have honest feedback loops amongst their peers. So really that leads us to the third reason, which is it's really critical to equip families and their partners to achieve their purposeful outcomes with the tools, with the resources, and with the skills needed to do the work, right? So once we elevate that conversation and once we have a common commitment and we're able then to build community and activate people based on that commitment, then we really need to equip them with tools and resources. Another point is that really institutionalizing family philanthropy also elevates the sector as a whole. And it really formalizes promising trends, right? It really galvanizes a community around what we are seeing that is to be held as the hallmark of effective philanthropy. And I'd like to maybe take a moment to reflect on some of those trends. Really, there's three of them that I'd like to call out here. The first is that the pace of giving is accelerating globally. We're really seeing philanthropic families shift into action. They're giving big, they're giving now. You know, the current moment, series of moments really over the last year, is a reminder of the long-held belief that philanthropic dollars truly do serve as risk capital for innovation and social impact. And it's also clear that safe approaches are not sufficient. They're not working, right? These long-standing challenges like health and education, clean water, pandemic preparedness is woefully insufficient, right? So it's really interesting because in this moment, giving families are being asked to revisit their approach and in many ways justify their approach and are asked and invited to be bold. The second trend that we're seeing is that the practice itself of giving is shifting. So what we're seeing and what we have seen over the last year is that philanthropy is really normalizing a trust-based approach that accelerates learning and partnership and hopefully minimizes power dynamics and the burden placed on nonprofit partners. Now, we have a long way to go on that, but we're seeing philanthropic families really starting to leverage multi-year grants, shifting to fewer reporting requirements, and opting into general operating support. These are all brilliant trends and trends that we have to continue to advance forward. We're also seeing that families are listening to the communities that they seek to serve, or at least acknowledging that they need to listen to communities that they seek to serve. And they have to understand the need to be more closely connected to those more proximate to the work. And lastly, what we're seeing is the purpose of philanthropy that's being revisited, this very concept of stewardship that's being challenged as society reckons with longstanding oppression, systemic injustice. And it's really interesting because donors are being asked to reflect on how they're really managing funds earmarked for the public good, perhaps for the first time.
Thanks.
So,
sorry, Nick, I'm just interrupting here, but again, you sort of left it at a good place, a stewardship, and that's where I want to actually bring in Deval now.
Perfect.
Thanks, Nick, for your perspective. Definitely innovation, partnership, capacity building, really some keywords here. And on that, Deval, I'd like to invite you for the next few minutes to share your journey. You've been speaking to families for 21 years, at the same time sort of working with community up close. And we heard this in the morning from you. A quick sort of, your reflections and just everything that you're hearing from people for the last sort of an hour and a half would be great to sort of bring us back to where we started.
Of course, Megha, thank you. And thank you all the other speakers as well. Clearly, it takes more than a village, to create impact. And we're so lucky as Dasra to have all of you as our partners on this mission. As Neera started this session off, really, this is about 1 billion thriving in India. And I think for that to occur, we all need to play a role. And I guess we've been fortunate at Dasra, as you were alluding to, Megha, to have spent many years and working with families across the world in enabling them to add to this mission and vision of 1 billion thriving. I think to begin with, though, and I know we have about 195 people on the call now, it would be good for everyone just to close your eyes, just for a second, please. And I want you to close your eyes, because I think it's important to remember what's happened in the last 12 months. And when you think about what's happened in India, and Hitan, thank you for talking about some of the images that we saw of hundreds of millions of people in India having to walk back home, thousands of kilometers, dragging their families along, being locked out of their homes, of their place of employment, of the entire transportation sector. I think it's important to understand, and these were just some of the tragedies that we saw in India, in the US and in the UK. We've seen Black Lives Matters movements going on. We've seen communities across the board that unfortunately have been structurally oppressed for generations. And it took a once in a lifetime or once in 100-year sort of pandemic to highlight how much we as a society have discriminated against these groups. And I think that's important just because, and you can open your eyes right now unless you don't want to see my face, which is fine. You can keep it closed then. I think this is really important because I hope at least, and I've said this now, probably 4 times in the last 21 years when we've seen economic downturns occur, I hope we don't actually forget what has happened and what has got us here in the first place. And I think that's extremely important and critical in the Indian context. We have 270 million workers that are still claimed to be part of the informal worker force. I say that because there's only 8% of us that have the opportunity to have jobs, work like we have been for the last year, buy computers, et cetera, have health insurance, have social security, have rights in terms of when we get fired, if we get fired, what that means. But 92% of our population in India, a working population, does not have that access. We have turned a blind eye on them for long enough. These are the individuals who build our cities, that supply our factories, that grow our food. Without them, India would not be India. And yet, like I said, it took this pandemic for us to all realize, hopefully, how much we were part of the problem in terms of allowing these things to occur. I remember early in the pandemic, one of the families in Pune that we work quite closely with, we were having a conversation with them. And they were talking about a conversation they had with their father and really asking about slums in Pune. And asking 60, 70 years ago, were slums around, or is this a new phenomenon? And their father stated slums actually have been around for as long as he remembers. And I bring this up just because as a society, we have allowed for this to occur. We enable, the discrimination, the lack of rights, the lack of dignity and equity across the board. And so I think while today's conversation is very much about, moving people from a 0.1% to a 0.3%, and that is fantastic. I think we need to actually address the issues we have as a country in front of us, and what do we want to do as leaders, as the haves, as those who are responsible to do more to actually change the situation. I think Nelson Mandela said it best, where he talked about poverty, and his quote is, like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the action of human beings. And I bring this up because we are all, not just the 189 that are on the call now, but the hundreds and thousands that were highlighted in this report, have the ability to actually make a dent in this problem. We need to stop thinking about how much we can give, whether it's 0.1% or 0.3% or even 0.5%, to actually what is the problem that we see in front of us? And honestly, how much do we need and do our children need and our grandchildren need to live a good life? And how do we start thinking about giving, you know, a larger percentage of our income, time, and equity and power, like Sonal spoke about, away? Because the only way this is going to change is if we all are in it together and we're introspective about what we have done to contribute to this issue, versus turning the blind eye, assuming that, you know, when things are good, we will give again. You know, that attitude, I think, has to change for us to achieve our goals. Now, like Hadi said, I'm also very bullish. I remember in 2011, in fact, we were up scheduling our second Indian Philanthropy Forum the same week that Bill Gates, Melinda Gates, and Warren Buffett were coming to town, and we rescheduled that particular philanthropy week to June. And so I remember vividly sort of when these individuals came, the creation of the India Philanthropy Initiative, and how much change has happened, and of course the great work that's happened in the last year. But as Hitin said, this cannot be something that we do when disaster strikes and end at that. We need to actually start questioning what caused that disaster in the first place. I think we in the development sector, including NGO leaders as well as givers, focus too much on the survival or the bare minimum on what needs to be done versus thriving of communities. None of us actually wake up in the morning and question how come the children that we see living in our slums in rural India or on the pavements, why don't they get the same life that we give our children? How come they don't have those same opportunities? And how do we sort of change this mindset of a percentage of giving to actually, how do you solve the problem? We've been very fortunate, as Megha talked about, in just the last few years, to have 37 unicorns. These are companies that are worth billions of dollars now. And I think India has demonstrated in the last 21 years since we've started Dasra, the bold, ambitious nature of our business leaders, of our families, to make a difference in society and to build some of the best companies that we see globally. Yet that same boldness and ambition, unfortunately, doesn't translate as much as it needs to be to philanthropy. This is a moral duty. This is an ethical duty. This is what nationalism is about. And I call all of you to sort of not just look at, you know, the Dasra Bain report in the IPR of the bare minimum or even matching what the US has done in terms of their giving, whether it's 3% or the annual disbursements of 1.2%. But more importantly, ask ourselves, what society do we want India to be by 2030? What can we do to accelerate that? And how do we actually create a different world or a different country where there's greater equality? And I think at least for the past year, for me at least, and those at Dasra, I think we've been introspecting on both the good that we've done, but also the negatives that we've done. I mean, we've held these gatherings at 5-star hotels, which limit those who can attend. At times, we have put families and philanthropists on pedestals when honestly, it's the community who we should be putting on pedestals. And at times, we support organizations and entities that have the highest ability to scale, but not necessarily those that are most needed by the community. And I say this because I think it's time for all of us to be introspective, not just what we do in our giving, but also, as Joe hinted, what we do in our day-to-day lives. And start making this difference. Because if we really want the next decade, as Hadi said, to be the decade of families and philanthropy, we all need to make changes. And honestly, the 0.1, the 0.3, or even 2% is not the ambitious goals that we need from each and every one sitting on this panel. And more importantly, from each and every one who is worth over 1,000 crores or more in our country. We should be looking at 5%, 10%, and solving the issues so then children across our country and women and mothers and sisters are given the same dignity and equity that we expect of our own family members. And so for me, family giving is about treating people as if they are your family and taking that stance to make decisions as we go forward. Thank you all for participating today. Megha, I'm going to hand it back to you to sum up the conversation.
Thank you, Deval. Thank you. And you've actually summed it up beautifully, but before we sort of close out, I think the 10, sort of 7 to 8 words that are sort of coming to my mind by all of the speakers that I've highlighted is really look at 10 years horizon. This is golden age for family philanthropy in India. Think about now generation, they are what they are. So now gen, values, humility, trust, listening to the community, economic multiplier, innovation, partnership, and last but not the least, introspection. Thank you so much, all the speakers, for also sort of personally sharing your stories. This was super, super helpful and helped us connect to everything that we hear in the report. The report is really available for all of you to download and read through, share within your network. In case if you would like to have a conversation with us regarding anything and everything related to your philanthropy, we are available for you. We will post my email address and happy to sort of help you navigate through there. I also wanted to invite all of you 173 people here that we have interesting sessions on various topics throughout the week. We do hope you log in and share with your network so that we can continue this conversation. This is only the first one amongst the many to come. Thank you so much for being an amazing audience. There is a poll for feedback, which will take less than 30 seconds. And if I can please have Dasra team flash that.